Hello and welcome to History for Today. We are going to be going down the rabbit hole of the Tower of London. I absolutely love the Tower of London because it is full of so much history. It has been around forever. It is used for lots of different things, not just a prison. It has lots of different purposes, but today I just wanted to focus on it as a prison and some of its most notorious and famous prisoners. So let's get started. I always think that it's good to start right back at the beginning, so I thought we would start with the very first prisoner of the Tower of London, Bishop Ranoff Flambard. Very interesting name, I love his name. He was also the first person to actually escape from the Tower of London, so he is famous for two very interesting reasons. Bishop Flambard is actually going to take us right back in history to the year 1100. So long ago. The bishop was a very influential government minister to King William Rufus. However, after King Rufus's death, his successor, the very first King Henry, had Bishop Ranoff thrown into prison in the Tower of London under charges of embezzlement. Under the previous king's reign, he had had jurisdiction over many financial matters. The new King Henry I used him as a bit of a scapegoat for some of the shady dealings that had gone on. It's kind of cool that not only was he the first prisoner, he was also the first prisoner to escape. Obviously they hadn't quite sorted out their security that well at the time, but he fled to Normandy and lived in exile with none other than King Henry's and King Rufus's brother. And he ended up living a pretty relatively normal life in exile, and he died of an old age. Nice natural death, and he didn't end up on the executioner's block, which is lucky for him, as so many of the people did when they entered into the Tower of London. They didn't come out again. Next on our list is Thomas Seymour. He was the husband of King Henry VIII's widow, Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr had actually wanted to marry Thomas Seymour instead of King Henry VIII, but when the king asks you to marry him, you kind of do what he says, especially when he has a history of executing his wives. And he had a pretty good track record of just executing a whole bunch of people. During his reign, he executed 57,000 people, it is estimated, which makes you not really want to get on his bad side. So she ended up marrying King Henry VIII, but after he passed away, she ended up marrying Thomas Seymour a few months later in a bit low-key, under the table kind of thing, because people thought it was probably a bit early. It was only about 3 months after King Henry's death that she ended up marrying Thomas Seymour. Unfortunately, Catherine Parr actually passed away not long after, and Thomas Seymour got himself into a little bit of strife. He was already in pretty deep water when he was caught outside the king's apartments at Hampton Court Palace with a loaded pistol. The king's dog started barking and he shot the dog, which was not a good idea because it alerted a lot of other people, I guess. And being found outside the king's window with a loaded gun is really just not going to end well for you, and he was taken off to the Tower of London under charges of treason. He was accused of 33 counts of treason and he was executed. Next is one of my personal heroes, Lady Jane Grey. She lived a pretty miserable life right up to her death. She died as a young teenage girl, and it was just such a sad life for her. She's often referred to as England's 9-day queen. After King Edward's death, the government decided that they wanted to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne rather than the rightful heir, who was Mary I, King Henry VIII's oldest child and oldest daughter. Lady Jane Grey wanted nothing to do with becoming queen. She very, very reluctantly took the crown, and she really did not want it. 9 days after she was put on the throne, Mary and her sister Elizabeth came riding into London, and Lady Jane Grey very willingly handed over the throne without any argument or any fight at all. She was very happy to get rid of it, but Mary did put her in the Tower of London to await her fate. She said, "Can I just go home now?" And Mary was like, "No, I don't think so." So she put her in the Tower of London and to await her fate. And she had a little bit of hope. They thought, oh, maybe that she will be able to get out. But her brothers and her father decided that they were going to try and rebel against Queen Mary, the now crowned Queen Mary. And Queen Mary didn't like that, so she thought, well, I already have Lady Jane Grey in the tower. I'm just going to execute her now. So she was taken to be executed. I think she was about 17 years old, which is just so horrible. She really honestly did not have a great life. if you want to learn a little bit more about her, I'll put a link down below so you can watch that video as well, because her story is really quite sad and it will bring tears to your eyes, I'm sure. Now we have two of the most famous queens in history, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. They were both wives of King Henry VIII, and he had them executed, both of them. Anne Boleyn, he pursued for years. He really wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. She was his second wife. He even had the whole country change its religion and made himself head of the church so that he would be able to marry her. And in the end, she was just a bit too much, and he didn't want to marry her. He didn't want to be married to her anymore, and he needed to find a way to get rid of her. So he had her charged with treason and incest with her brother. But the truth is, she actually never did anything wrong. She was not sleeping with her brother or anything like that. She was just doing what she was supposed to do, but he needed a way to get rid of her. She was the mother of Queen Elizabeth I. There is thinking that maybe one of the reasons that he didn't want to be married to her anymore was because she couldn't produce a male heir, but to be honest, he really didn't give her that much time to come up with a male heir. Her execution was really quite unprecedented. There had never been a queen executed before, so it was all very new. She was executed with a swordsman rather than an axe, which was also quite new. So after being kept in the Tower of London, she was promptly taken to the executioner's block and she was executed. Her body is now with her brother, who was also executed in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula at the Tower of London. Catherine Howard was wife number 5 for Henry VIII, and he had her sent to the Tower of London to await her execution on charges of adultery and treason. She was a bit of a party girl, and she brought a lot of fun and excitement and laughter to the Tudor court, and I don't think Henry quite liked that. She was just a bit too much, a bit too fun and a bit too vibrant for him. She was only 17 and he was almost 50 at this point. That is a pretty huge age gap, and maturity levels probably very different as well. Not that I can say that Henry VIII was very mature. He just seemed to have no maturity about him at all, to be honest. But he had her sent to the Tower of London on treason and adultery because she apparently had not been very virtuous prior to their marriage, and she had not disclosed her indiscretions, so to speak, before marrying him, and he was not happy with that. So off to the Tower of London she went, and she was promptly executed, which is really sad for such a young girl. I don't know if she really even wanted to marry Henry VIII. Maybe she was scared like other people. You just didn't want to cross him because he has a record of executing a ton of people. Talking about Henry VIII's maniacal reign and all his executions, another one of his victims was Margaret Pole, who he sent to the Tower of London. She remained in the Tower of London for 2.5 years. She was an elderly woman, and her crime was that she loved her son, really. She was Catholic, and Henry VIII wanted everybody to be Protestant at this point. And her son was very outspoken. Her son Reginald was very outspoken against Henry VIII, and because he was a Catholic. And so he fled the country, and he went around Europe trying to convince other royalty and other nations around Europe to help him get Henry kicked off the throne. And Henry obviously was not happy about that. He's like, why are you doing this? And since Henry was very unhappy about that, as Henry would be, and he couldn't get to Reginald, he decided that he would go after his mother instead, which is a great way to cause a lot of pain to somebody, going after their family and those that they love. And no matter what Margaret Pole did, nothing could convince Henry to spare her. She wrote letters to him denouncing her son's behaviour, but it made no difference. Henry VIII was not in any mood to care, and so he ordered to have her executed. This was not a popular decision because Margaret Pole at the time, she was quite elderly, and they thought it was very cruel to execute a woman who was likely to pass away in the not too distant future. Nonetheless, she was removed from the Tower of London and taken to the executioner's block, where they had to hack at her to finish the job. It took, I think, 11 blows before she was finally executed. Apparently the axeman was a novice and he may have been slightly drunk when he was performing the execution, and my heart breaks for this old lady and enduring that because she really hadn't done anything wrong. Another royal who was taken to the Tower of London and became one of its most famous prisoners was Elizabeth I, Queen Elizabeth I, and she was placed in the Tower of London by her sister, Queen Mary I. They had a bit of a tumultuous relationship, I think, and I find what is interesting now is they're buried next to each other, which is quite interesting, I think. Queen Elizabeth was sent to the Tower of London because Queen Mary thought that she was involved in some kind of plot to get her off the throne. Elizabeth was sent to the Tower of London with her 2 ladies' maids, and I can imagine that she was probably very, very terrified. She knew exactly what happened to a lot of people who were sent to the Tower of London. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been sent to the Tower of London and she never came out. Eventually she was able to convince Mary after a lot of interrogation that she was not involved in any plot to try and get her off the throne at all. Queen Mary was very, very cunning, and when she approved for Elizabeth to be released from the Tower, and she had her release on the anniversary of her mother's execution, her mother Anne Boleyn's execution. And what that tells me is Queen Mary was saying to Elizabeth, don't you cross me, just watch, I can have you end up just like your mother. And I don't think I don't think that was lost on Elizabeth. I think she knew exactly what Mary was doing, and she didn't really have much trouble with her after that. Next we have William Wallace. Oh my brave heart, I love this man. He is without a doubt one of Scotland's greatest heroes. The battles between England and Scotland were fierce, and William Wallace led many of the Scots to battle as a valiant and courageous leader. He was eventually captured and sent to the Tower of London as a prisoner in 1305. The end of his most incredible life was nothing short of humiliation. He was sentenced to be hung, drawn and quartered, which is one of the most horrific ways that you can be executed or put to death. If you have the stomach for it, I have a video about it that I will link below. But it is just a horrific way to die. William Wallace definitely goes down in history as one of the most famous prisoners of the Tower of London. Next we have Protestant martyr Anne Askew. She was an incredibly strong and courageous woman. She was taken to the Tower of London and endured such horrendous torture. She was put on the rack in just her undergarments, and they twisted and turned the rack over and over again as they pulled her limbs from her body. She was so battered and worn that when she was taken to her execution, because they couldn't get anything out of her, she was not saying a word against anybody. She just stood her ground, and she was sentenced to be executed by fire. And as they took her to her execution, she couldn't walk. Her body was so broken that they had to carry her to her execution, and she was tied to the stake and she was burned at the stake. But she just stood for her faith. She was a Protestant martyr, and she just knew what she believed, and there was absolutely nothing in the world that was going to make her denounce her faith or what she believed or anybody else. She was not going to put anyone else in hot water. She just endured it all. She's not only famous for being a prisoner of the Tower of London, she's famous for the torture that she actually endured there. There was so much torture that actually happened in the Tower of London. So many different types of torture, the manacles, the rack, it is just honestly horrific what people used to do to each other. I don't know as humans how we can be so cruel to one another. Alright, we cannot leave this video without talking about the Little Princes. The Tower of London and the Little Princes are just like peanut butter and jam going together. You can't tell one story without telling the other. In 1483, the 2 princes, 12-year-old Edward V and his little brother, 9-year-old Richard, were placed in the Tower of London for their so-called protection. Their father, King Edward IV, had just died, and their uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, had become their protector. It was under his orders that Edward was sent to the Tower of London. He was soon followed by his little brother. Their mother had tried to keep her children with her. It was obvious that she did not trust her brother-in-law. Reluctantly, she let them go, and she was never to see her little boys again. The Duke putting the boys in the tower did not seem at all unusual. They were young, and he had managed to convince people that it was all in an effort to protect them from the turmoil that was occurring at the time. The Tower of London was also the place where the start of the coronation process for a new monarch began, and it was traditional for the new monarch to stay there until the coronation process. The Tower of London was not simply used as a prison, it served many, many purposes. Now comes the mystery that has stumped the world for centuries. It is widely believed that in the autumn of 1483, the little princes of the Tower were quietly murdered. No one knows who carried out this deplorable act, but there are several plausible theories, the main one being their uncle, Duke of Gloucester, who very conveniently became the next reigning king, King Richard III. This is a story that you could spend weeks and weeks just poring over, and you will never find all the information that there is to find. I don't think we will ever really know what happened to these little boys. I think it is just going to go down in history as one of those unsolved stories that is just the biggest mystery of the time. I hope that one day we find out what happened to these little boys, find out the truth, but I'm not very hopeful that we ever will. Those are some of the most famous prisoners that were in the Tower of London. There are many, many more prisoners that we could talk about who graced the Tower of London with their presence, but we do not have time to talk about everybody today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you learned something, and I look forward to seeing you next time.